Hi all. In this lesson, we're going to focus on a second key sociological perspective, the conflict model. You can find some information in the first chapter of the textbook, as well as on pages 8 and 9 of study guide number 1 that relate to this particular approach or perspective. Last time, if you remember, we examined the functionalist perspective, or the structural functionalist perspective, that emphasized relationships among the components or the structural arrangements that make up society. And concern was directed toward how these components fit together and contribute to the success, the smooth operation of the overall system. And as is noted on pages 7 and 8 in your first study guide, and this is highlighted in the first chapter in the text as well, this model is based upon the argument that change works most efficiently. Although it's a part of human social life, it's most effective if it's slow-paced, allowing plenty of time for society and its components to make adjustments. But if you'll highlight on page 8, and let me offer a little different take. This is not included in the study guide, but it isn't anything that you, again, necessarily need to write down. But take a moment and look over this relatively brief overview of the conflict model. Notice the focus. Okay. Also, bear in mind this model emphasizes that change is an inevitable part of human social life, and it's often abrupt or sudden. And it is also often the result of conflicts between and among individuals, groups, organizations, and the like. Now this conflict can take a lot of different forms. It can be violent, but most often it's in the form of competing for that which is highly valued or considered important. So as you'll notice here, the model emphasizes, or at least argues, that society is characterized by inequality. Society is really comprised of individuals, groups, organizations, etc., all competing for limited but valued resources, such as money, wealth, healthcare, housing, material goods, but above all, power. Remember, if you have power, you can in effect make other people do what you wish. Furthermore, the model argues that those who have access to these scarce but very, very valuable resources work to protect what they have at the expense of others, as well as trying to gain even more of these valued resources. So, a key orientation or focus of this model really is who or what benefits and who or what gets taken advantage of. To use an old phrase, gets ripped off. Now, Karl Marx is one of a number of sociologists who really have their handprints all over this particular model. And he highlighted the fact, and later researchers have taken this a step further, that those who have valued resources, particularly power, will exploit others in a variety of different ways. Over on the 9th page of your study guide, one particular approach or technique that the powerful, those who have access to these highly valued resources, might employ to maintain their status, their position, their hold on these valued resources, is through what Marx called false consciousness. Kind of a fancy phrase that really reflects the fact that some people end up accepting beliefs, values, practices that actually work against their best interest, even though there's really nothing there to support it. I remember looking at an example of false consciousness. In 1972, the Democratic Party's nominee for president was George McGovern. And as part of his platform, he argued for a law that would specify anybody who inherited in excess of $500,000. Anything beyond that $500,000 would be taxed away by the federal government. Now, some observers have argued that this was a nail in his political coffin, that maybe more than anything else, this cost him the election. If any of you are familiar with the history of presidential elections, he lost in a massive landslide to the incumbent, Richard Nixon. If I remember correctly, the only state that he carried was Massachusetts. Now, his idea was that this would not have a profound impact. As a matter of fact, research indicated that if this were to become a law, only about 1% of the American population would have been impacted. But fascinatingly enough, the biggest complaints came from those in the lower middle class and the lower class. Those who had no chance at all of ever inheriting that amount of money. So the question remains, why? Well, one explanation might be the American dream. Even though it was probably 99.9% unlikely that most Americans would ever inherit that much money, many of them clung to the notion that, well, it could happen, and the last thing I want is the government taking away what is mine. Now, there are some examples that I can highlight to more or less illustrate the influence of, or at least the orientation of, the conflict model. Take a look at sports again. Certainly, you all would agree with me, and we highlighted this in the last lesson. Sport can support key values and social structures: loyalty, teamwork, achievement. It can also provide a really effective sense of identification and commitment. But those who use the conflict model would argue that sport today has lost much of its original aspects of play and enjoyment due to the heavy emphasis placed upon winning, competition, and profits. Sport has become, so the argument goes by the conflict theorist, big business, with powerful people and structures exploiting players as well as fans. Sport has become increasingly professionalized and formally structured. Some making the argument that college football amounts to nothing more than kind of a farm system for the NFL and generates enormous profits for the school, but not for the players themselves. And those sociologists using the conflict perspective argue that in the end result, a kind of elitist system has been created in which a very small number of players ever make it to the big show, the NFL, Major League Baseball, etc. And even a smaller number become superstars. In addition, conflict theorists argue that sport can teach values and behaviors that are actually exploitative. They're inhumane, and may even encourage the notion that hard work, dedication is enough for success. Now, on the other hand, if you apply this perspective to the media, conflict-oriented researchers might argue that the media is really a tool for the powerful and for the elites. They employ the media to maintain the status quo. Generally speaking, those with power, those who have access to valued resources, the last thing they want is change unless they can control it. They're benefiting from the way things are right now. Furthermore, they use the media to cultivate consumers and to disseminate or spread information which benefits their vested interest and those of corporations and organizations which control the media. Conflict-oriented sociologists might also argue that despite the appeal and the open availability of more recent media forms like smartphones, interactive videos, Twitter, the internet, etc., they are disproportionately available to the elites and to wealthy societies. Guest, for example, notes in his text on cultural anthropology that today 50% of the world's population has cell phones, but a majority of the people live in Europe, Asia, and North America. There are other areas of the world that are largely excluded. Now, if you will notice over on the first page of the study guide, and this goes on over for several other pages, I highlighted globalization. What you see basically here is sort of a working definition of globalization. And conflict theorists have pointed out the fact that in many respects, powerful commercial interests have employed globalization, or maybe I should say have benefited from globalization, because they can now move many of their operations to other countries due to remarkable advances in communication and increasing ease of transportation. You know what I'm talking about. It's called outsourcing. And companies who engage in this activity often again defend their moves as a way of keeping their operational costs low and at the same time maintaining low prices for the products that they produce. Conflict-oriented researchers have argued this is really a ploy by which a company or a corporation can now, by moving their operations somewhere else, they can pay lower wages to workers, they can benefit from lower taxes, and they can escape, or at least encounter, fewer environmental regulations. And last but not least, let's go back to the discussion we had with respect to applying the functionalist model to prostitution. Conflict-oriented sociologists argue that prostitution is an economic interaction resulting from what they call differential access to legitimate but limited rewards. In other words, prostitution reflects more than anything else inequality and sexism. The fact that women are secondary to men. Let's develop this argument a little bit more. According to the conflict approach, women throughout history haven't had the same access, generally speaking, to economic rewards as men. Hence, they've been put into a position in which they have had to rely upon men for economic support. Conflict-oriented researchers have argued they gain this support by using and exchanging their sexual availability, the one limited but highly valued resource that they have. And for these researchers, it really doesn't matter if a woman exchanges her sexual availability through something like marriage or prostitution. The cause, they argue, is the same. Now, next time, we'll look at a third key theoretical perspective in sociology known as symbolic interactionism.